Creo que lo que procede es que avancemos con la jornada y vayamos a la ponencia marco, que va a contextualizar nuestra querida compañera Graciela Marchesini, y en la que pilotará el discurso nuestro compañero Matías de la estructura europea de la EAPN. Muchísimas gracias a todo el mundo.
Gracias, Adolfo. Bueno, buenos días a todas, a todos. Tengo el gusto de presentar en este momento el panel, la ponencia marco, salarios mínimos justos en el contexto del empleo de calidad. Y para hacer esto voy a introducir el tema para tratar de explicar, a ver, un momentito, para explicar, no puedo hacerlo, a ver, bueno, pues nada, aquí está, perdón. Para explicar el contexto europeo en el que luego le hemos pedido a Matías que nos sitúe la acción de EAPN. Y lo voy a hacer explicando, partiendo un poquito de este contexto que os comentaba, en el que el Tratado de Lisboa, que es el que está en funcionamiento en este momento, le permite a la Comisión Europea y a la Unión Europea tener competencias en el ámbito del empleo. Por eso es muy importante tener siempre la mirada de lo que está pasando en Europa, ¿no? Le permite que a partir del artículo 153 se puedan desarrollar directivas que establezcan requisitos mínimos para condiciones de trabajo y empleo, y también para todo lo relativo a la información y consulta a las personas trabajadoras. Concretamente, el artículo 151 también habla de la capacidad de la Unión Europea de apoyar o completar la acción de los estados en una serie de temas relacionados con el empleo, como el entorno de trabajo, la salud y la seguridad, las condiciones de trabajo, la protección y la seguridad social, la información, la representación colectiva, la situación de los derechos de los trabajadores de terceros países, que ha dado lugar a una reciente directiva, la integración de las personas excluidas en el mercado laboral y la igualdad de hombres y mujeres en el mercado laboral, ¿no? Entonces, esto se plasma a través de la Estrategia Europa 2020, que termina en este año, en una meta concreta de empleo, que es esta, que está aquí señalada, que indicaba que íbamos a llegar para esta fecha, que estamos ahora, a un 75% de ocupación de los hombres y mujeres comprendidos en edades entre 20 y 64 años, incrementando la participación de los jóvenes y trabajando también para incorporar al mercado a aquellos que estaban más alejados o en situación de exclusión, como las personas inmigrantes o con baja cualificación. La realidad, al finalizar la estrategia, aquí tenemos España, es que no se ha cumplido con la estrategia, con la meta de empleo, tal como se había previsto en términos medios, pero vemos que en más oscuro, como hay varios países que sí han alcanzado y superado esa meta, ¿no? Lo cual nos está indicando una situación especial, y es que Europa no tiene el mismo problema en todos los Estados miembros con respecto al tema del empleo. Hay algunos que estamos mal y otros que no están mal. Si vemos las metas, aquí tenemos la situación de España. Nuestra meta era el 74% de empleo, y en el año 19 habíamos llegado al 68%, mientras que el resto de la Unión Europea en su conjunto había llegado casi a la meta con un 73,9%. Si nosotros nos separan 5 puntos de esa meta, nos separaban, porque en realidad, si desagregamos un poquito esa meta, vemos que no todo el mundo le fue igual, ¿no? A los hombres sí lograron prácticamente llegar a la meta en España, sí la superaron, incluso llegaron bien en la media europea, pero las mujeres están muy lejos de ese 75%. Están en España en el 62% y en media europea en el 68%. Es decir, que hay claramente una feminización de la inactividad por un lado, que no se ve reflejada en este dato, y del desempleo, que sí se ve reflejado en este dato. En el año 2017, el anterior gobierno de la Comisión promulga, junto con el resto de instituciones, el Pilar Europeo de Derechos Sociales, que, como veis, está dividido en 3 capítulos, pero prácticamente montones de estos artículos, los que están en amarillo, corresponden a mercado de trabajo. Entre otras cosas, porque para eso Europa tiene competencias. Y, por ejemplo, cuando aquí se menciona en el punto 2 igualdad de género, se refiere a la igualdad de género en el mercado, entre hombres y mujeres, en el mercado de trabajo. Bien, este es un marco que todavía está por implementar, se va a implementar a través de directivas o de distintos mecanismos de regulación blanda, de lo cual nos va a hablar Matías más adelante. El problema que tenemos en España es que nuestra recuperación es más tardía y estamos en una situación peor con respecto al empleo creado que el resto de Europa. Si vemos el impacto de la pandemia ya con datos de octubre del 2020, tenemos una tasa de paro del 16%, un 8% para la eurozona y un 7,4% para la Unión Europea de los 27. Es decir, que el problema del desempleo es un problema básicamente de algunos Estados miembros, pero no del conjunto. Ahora mismo tenemos, en el contexto de la pandemia, y como explicó Carlos, el despliegue de sistemas temporales de retención de empleo en casi toda la Unión Europea, una expansión de empleo atípico antes de la llegada de la pandemia. Empleo atípico lo llaman la Comisión, pero en realidad nosotros le decimos empleo precario, empleo sin que lleve derechos implicados, ¿no? Y que afecta sobre todo a jóvenes, mujeres e inmigrantes, salarios mínimos en algunos países por debajo del umbral de la pobreza, tensión en el sistema de protección social por la caída de la actividad económica y de la recaudación, y, como dije antes, situaciones muy diversas en los Estados miembros, que también en parte nos tienen que servir para entender las distintas posturas políticas con respecto a la legislación europea. Quiero invitaros a los que tengáis ganas o interés hasta el día 12 a participar en una consulta abierta que hay que es el Pacto sobre Capacidades, y os voy a dejar el enlace para que podáis dar vuestra opinión. Y paso entonces, con este contexto, a explicar qué le hemos pedido a Matías Mauger que nos cuente. Matías es responsable de investigación, abogacía y políticas de EAPN Europa, es una persona muy experta en temas de empleo, le ha dedicado muchos años de su vida, y vamos a aprovechar esa experiencia también para que nos cuente cuáles deberían ser los requisitos mínimos a considerar en la implementación de un marco europeo para salarios mínimos justos, que respondan a esas tasas de pobreza en el empleo o de trabajadores pobres. ¿Qué información nos puede decir más actualizada sobre qué está haciendo la Comisión en este tema? ¿Cuáles son las prioridades, requisitos y preocupaciones de EAPN Europa en vistas de estas acciones sobre salarios mínimos y justos? ¿Cuál es el papel que estamos desarrollando o que queremos desarrollar en el desarrollo de marcos y estrategias que ayuden a paliar la desigualdad existente en Europa, por ejemplo, con una directiva sobre rentas mínimas o ingresos mínimos garantizados? Y cómo hacer para contar con la opinión y la visión y las experiencias de las personas en situación de pobreza. Para darle paso a Matías, voy a, antes de eso, recordaros que si queréis escuchar la traducción, tenéis que ponerlo en español, ¿vale? Y si no, disfrutar del inglés de Matías. Matías, the floor is yours. Puedes hablar a continuación. Muchas gracias.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Buenos días a todas y todos. Thanks a lot, Graciela, Adolfo, and Carlos for the words of welcome. As Graciela said, I'm the policy officer of European anti-poverty network, and I was asked to, if you can see this, I was asked to do 3 things, as Graciela said this morning. First of all, to talk on decent minimum wages, and to do this fair minimum, decent minimum wages in the context of quality employment from an EU perspective, but I will also obviously try to do this from the perspective of people experiencing poverty and social exclusion. Other speakers have already referred to this. We are in, since 6 months, we have the COVID pandemics, and we have already seen, and also thanks to a study that Graciela did on behalf of EAPN, that in the last months, poverty levels were already high, but poverty increased and will increase in the next months and years. The risk is very high. Inequalities have already been increasing, and that is obviously also true for unemployment. So I have seen that the Spanish title of the conference is Pobreza, Empleo y Bienestar Social, Desafíos para Políticas de Empleo Digno. And that's also why we, and you have the term digno, why we use normally in EAPN the term decent minimum wages. This is also the term that is used by the trade unions and by the European, by the International Labour Organization. So I will talk about the current framework and then about our priorities. Second is, as you see here, EAPN is the biggest European network of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, fighting against poverty and social exclusion, advocacy organizations, self-help organizations, service providers. And I will introduce a little bit, and Graciela has already talked about this, which are currently the relevant EU level frameworks and strategies to reduce, to prevent poverty, and especially also in-work poverty and social exclusion. You have 3, and I will talk about them. The European semester was mentioned by Graciela. The European pillar of social rights was also mentioned by Graciela. And then there are forms of structured dialogue. And finally, because it's strongly linked and it's a key topic for EAPN, always long-standing request of EAPN, a framework directive on minimum income. There is currently a window of opportunity to work towards this with council conclusions that the German presidency is preparing, and you see they will be normally adopted next week. So this webinar is very timely. So let's start now with, and I will stay a little bit longer here and then go quicker through the others, but to set the framework. First of all, decent minimum wages. What are the current activities by the European Commission? And then we have the European Trade Union Confederation, its positions and requests. I think that's important to set the frame, and then I will immediately jump into EAPN priorities and demands in relation to minimum wages or living wages also in general. So you have obviously seen, you are interested people, you follow the policy that with the new Commission, European Commission coming in last year in November, December, it was clear for the European Commission that minimum wages is a key topic for them, a key priority for them. That was already said by the current European Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights, Nicola Schmid, but it was also included immediately in the work program for this year by the European Commission, and it was also said by the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. And to start from the end, we expect by the end of this month, by end of October, we expect now finally that the European Commission will present a proposal, a legislative instrument on minimum wages. And in a conference Graciela and myself attended mid of September by the German presidency, he said this is very likely to be a directive. So we can expect a directive. And you see in the first bullet point what has happened already this year. So we already have had 2 phases, 2 rounds of social partner consultations. This means the trade unions and the employers, the European level employers and trade unions, and the national level trade unions and employers. But as I wrote here at the end, there has not been and there will not be any public consultation. So organizations such as EAPN, we could not directly participate. We could only, as is my last point, participate via exchanging with the European Trade Union Confederation. So, and what is important perhaps is that in this first phase consultation, as you see, already issues that are important for EAPN were mentioned. So it's a focus, the focus of the consultation was on income inequalities due to low wages and in-work poverty. And what can minimum wages do to do this? And also the second focus of the trade union work, but also of the European Commission, is how can you extend, how can you promote collective bargaining, the coverage of all workers by collective agreements, by social dialogue, by collective bargaining, also obviously in relation to minimum wages. And you know that there are two systems in the European Union, how to set minimum wages, the statutory, so the legally fixed minimum wages, which are the majority of countries of the old 28, 23, or 22, how you count it. And, but also legally fixed, if I take the example of my home country, Germany, there is a legal minimum wage since 2015, but also there it's very clear that it is actually fixed by social partners. They negotiate in a minimum wage commission and then it's adopted in a way. So, but then you have 5 or 6 countries, the Nordic countries in the EU, but also Austria and Italy and Cyprus that set their minimum wages by collective bargaining. And already in the first phase, the trade unions very clearly asked on a certain adequacy, on a decency of minimum wages. 60% of the full-time gross net median wage, so the wage that is in the middle of all wages. That should be the threshold for decency. Trade unions also asked to abolish minimum wages that are below the legally fixed one, for example, for young people, for young workers, or for unemployed that exists. And that's important for EAPN, they highlighted structural issues. We know that there are very clearly women are overrepresented. 60% of those at the minimum wage in Europe are women. Non-standard workers obviously are overrepresented there. There is a rising wage dispersion and job polarization. So more, it's not a convergence, but there are more differences, more broader gaps in the wages people get. Higher wages and lower wages, they shift more and more. And obviously, there is a real issue around in-work poverty. I will talk about this later. So then we had a staff working document. The Commission analyzed and it summarizes the replies from this first phase. And it highlighted some of these issues that I just mentioned. And it was also supported. So the European Commission took up also priorities, demands of the European Anti-Poverty Network, namely around the insufficient adequacy of the wages. So they also said it's clear that there are several countries where minimum wages are not adequate, where minimum wages are not at the 60% of the median wage, but sometimes even below 40% of the minimum wage. And that also includes countries like Spain, but also Belgium, Germany, for example, the Netherlands, Ireland, these countries. Portugal, I think, has around 44%. And also that the number of those low wage earners that say they cannot make ends meet, they cannot survive with their wage, is rather high in a lot of countries. In Greece, it's about over 60%, in Spain around 40%, and only in some countries it's below 10%, like Netherlands, Ireland, Finland, Germany, and Czech Republic. But there is a real problem with low wage earners. And there is a clear coverage of minimum wage arrangements, especially for precariously employed workers, for young workers, for migrant workers, for ethnic minority workers, and so on. And also increasing in-work poverty in about 16 of the 28 countries, so more than half the in-work poverty rate rose. And now the European Trade Union Confederation, they made a reply to this 2 consultations, social partner consultations. They made 2 replies, and I've summarized here what are the main demands. So it's very clear. The European Trade Union Confederation asked for a framework directive on minimum wages that also would guarantee the involvement of the social partners when setting minimum wages and social dialogue. And in addition, a council recommendation to deal with some issues that cannot be dealt with in the minimum, in the framework directive, is it asked for a double threshold, so a European minimum requirement on the minimum level of the wage. Wages should not fall under a threshold of 60% of the full-time gross national median wage and 50% of the average wage. And that's obviously related to questions of pay decency. And there is a lot of research that shows that minimum wages have no important negative impact on the competitiveness of enterprises, on the economic situation. That's not all there. They even help obviously adjust for previously too low wages, for example, in the restaurant sector, in cleaning, in hairdressing, in all these sectors. They help to increase the consumption potential, the potential to spend the money for the low wage earners, and that increases obviously the demand, and they increase the tax income and social contributions. They also, high or decent minimum wages have also positive effect on the whole wage grid, on all the other wages in the economy. And obviously they help to reduce the amounts of tax credits that countries are paying, governments are paying, or subsidies for low wage earners. So all this is the starting point. And now I go to the EAPN priorities and documents. And you see, for us, it's not about only minimum wages. There is a broader issue, and the topic of minimum wages is to be framed by issues around in-work poverty. As I already said, we now have currently in 2018, we had more than 20 million workers that don't earn enough to even achieve the 60% of the median income. And our demand is clearly that all jobs, all employment contracts should have decent standards of pay and benefits, decent working conditions, good occupational health and safety conditions, and an access to lifelong learning. Then EAPN has worked a lot on the topic of active inclusion. That is a concept that links the adequate income support with inclusive labor market access, and also access to essential and social services. And this all based on a case management approach and a personalized approach, because we know especially vulnerable groups, low qualified groups, marginalized groups, discriminated groups, and persons there need particular support, targeted support by public employment services to be able to reintegrate in employment. And then it's a strong link to access to social protection. And we obviously ask for that all workers should have access to social protection. That means coverage from pension, from health insurance, from unemployment insurance, family benefits. As I just said, supported pathways into employment. And I put here, and you can later have it, the sources for our work. We have a position paper, and we have worked with the European Economic Social Committee on decent wages. And for us, obviously, it's essential to ensure fair working conditions and decent living standards for all workers, to protect with all these rights the low wage workers, so to have a rights-based approach and to prevent in-work poverty. And here again, you see what are our main demands that we have around a European framework for minimum wages. So when we did our position paper in May, we didn't ask yet for a framework directive, but we asked for a European framework. But if this framework directive is achievable, also EAPN would obviously support it. And our demands are obviously based on the analysis that, as Graciela has said, in the last years, the soft law, the non-binding measures at European level have not delivered. They have failed to really fight in-work poverty and to lift up minimum wages. So our demand is also, as the trade unions have said, this European instrument, this legislation, this binding legislation would need to have a minimum requirement, a minimum benchmark, a minimum threshold, 60% of the median wage as the indicator for adequacy, for decency of the wages. And obviously collective bargaining would need to be promoted, defended, high coverage of collective agreements. That's the first step to prevent in-work poverty. So you need to have this first. And also, obviously, there are other directives that are currently being prepared. One to address the gender pay gap. I said that minimum wages are a particular challenge for women, for female employment. So the gender pay gap is sometimes immense in countries like also, for example, still in my home country, very strong gender pay gap, and also then a pension pay gap. And you also need binding pay transparency measures. It would also help a lot migrant workers, but again, women, if enterprises have to show their pay scales. So, and then we need to introduce minimum wages in all countries where this level, this threshold is not achieved, and where there is no strong collective bargaining. We would need to introduce statutory minimum wages. And we also need other soft law mechanisms, like I already said, a person-centered active inclusion approach, for example, and the European semester should support this policy by a fair wage priority, encourage an increase in wages, and also prioritize measures to reduce in-work poverty. Quickly, as a second part, where are our involvements? Where do we work as EAPN to all address these issues of decent minimum wages and fighting in-work poverty? There is the European semester, which is a mechanism that exists since 10 years. It was started as a mechanism to work on macroeconomic policies, but obviously, and it also covers social policy, even if it's not always in line with the priorities and the demands of EAPN, obviously. But we have seen, and that's also relevant for the minimum income, that the poverty reduction objective that was set by this European 2020 strategy, Graciela referred to this, that was not achieved. This has failed. EAPN has worked a lot in this European semester every year on the joint employment report, on the annual sustainable growth strategy. We have made inputs and analyzed the country reports and the country-specific recommendations. And if we only look to in-work poverty, then we will see that there is not a lot of focus on in-work poverty. In the country-specific recommendations of 2019, this was only highlighted for 3 countries, Ireland, Poland, and Portugal. But for those that have a very high rate of in-work poverty, like Romania, Luxembourg, United Kingdom, no mention of in-work poverty. In Spain, there was a certain focus on it, but in the last year, country-specific recommendations, but for us, not enough. It was mentioned not in the country-specific recommendations, only in the accompanying text. And so we have worked a lot on this. We have already demanded that civil society organizations and people experiencing poverty are strongly involved on the equal footing as social partners in all these processes. And then there is the European Pillar of Social Rights. That is the second framework we work on. As Graciela said, it's a set of principles. It's not binding. And before these principles can have any effect, either European member states or the European Commission would need to do policies, funding, or legislation. And as you see here, the EAPN's focus is on the 5 principles of these 20 principles, logically, minimum income, social protection, the wages. And in this pillar of social rights, Graciela showed it already, there is a principle 6 on wages, where it's mentioned that in-work poverty should be prevented. And then we are working on other priorities like education and essential services. And the third element we are using is structured dialogue. So there are different forums, different fora that the European Commission has with the member states where we have been involved. And you see that has been the case in particular on minimum income, on access to social protection, and on child poverty. So the third quick part still on minimum income, because it's very clearly linked to minimum wages. Again, we have done here a position paper. We have worked in a workshop of the German presidency that happened mid of September by the German Ministry of Labor, Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. They organized it with other organizations, where also Graciela spoke and presented the Spanish new national minimum income scheme. So we have prepared our documents. You have here our requests summarized in these documents. And as I said, we also try to promote the work of our members like EAPN Spain, the successful lobbying to introduce a national minimum income scheme, or other members like Latvia that also could highlight the inadequacy of their minimum income. And our request also here in the minimum income dossier is very clearly that we need a framework directive on minimum income. We need a common EU framework that sets minimum requirements for all EU member states. So to have a level playing field and minimum requirements to guarantee that really everybody, all people in the European Union will have an adequate minimum income both over their life course and in all countries. And that would support also like minimum wages, the social and economic upwards convergence. And here you see our main demands on what would be the contents of such a framework directive on minimum income. As I already said, we would need common principles and definitions on the adequacy, like for the minimum wages, on access to minimum income. That includes obviously the issues who is covered, what is the duration of benefit, and that also those that are entitled, that have the right, actually take up their right. They really ask for the benefit and don't, because they are ashamed or for other reasons they are not well informed, don't take their benefit. And that this has an enabling character. As for the minimum wage dossier here, we also have a minimum requirement, the risk of poverty threshold should be the European indicator for adequacy, and that needs to be underpinned by national reference budgets because there are different situations, living costs in different countries. But we also need a common methodology on this reference budget. And then very important for us, like on minimum wages, we are here talking about rights, a rights-based approach. Minimum wages and minimum income are social rights. They cannot be conditional on any requirements to access the labor market. And people cannot be forced into precarious jobs. They should not be forced into precarious jobs and working conditions. We need an EU-level monitoring framework for this and some benchmarks indicators and the European semester to support this. And obviously where levels of minimum income are already high, they should not be go down with a European framework, so a non-regression clause also, and support from EU funds. So this European Social Fund or the new facility that has been decided now with 370 billion euro, this Recovery Resilience Fund could help. And so finally, where are we now? Also, I have said on the minimum wages, we expect a proposal of the European Commission end of October, likely a directive. And currently on the minimum income area, we have council conclusions that the German presidency presented, council conclusions on minimum income protection. It was presented in July. And as you see, it should be adopted next Tuesday. So in 4 days, let's hope it will be adopted. The first draft looked very good and had mainly all EAPN requests that I showed you, mainly all included, nearly all. But in the negotiations with the member states, it has been watered down, has been reduced. And I jump to the concern immediately, this call to action that the European Commission now presents a proposal for a framework directive has been watered down. There is the member states are invited to work together to update the European framework that is there, but this call to action has been watered down. But it's still possible to, if the Commission has the political will, if member states like Spain support this, then it is still possible that the Commission comes up with a proposal for a binding instrument, for a directive, for a framework directive, because the elements that are in are positive and take up a lot of our demands. The Spanish government also insisted a lot on the fight against the gender dimension and child poverty. That was very much welcomed. And we will request a legal opinion where we will make the case that a binding EU-level initiative is possible on the basis of the article that Graciela showed, 153, but also on the basis of the social cohesion policy, 175. And so finally, the last question, and there I stop, is what will now happen in the action plan that Graciela mentioned, where a consultation is ongoing until end of November. There will be an action plan to implement this European Pillar of Social Rights, and we would hope that in this action plan we have included the framework directive or proposal for a framework directive on minimum income. And that's now the open question. What is the political pressure? What is the basis that we will have with these council conclusions that should be adopted next week, that we can get a good proposal that will help us to make progress on poverty reduction and will help us to have minimum income and minimum wages as a social right. I stop here and say to you, muchas gracias por su interés y atención. And thank you for your interest and attention, and looking forward to the exchange and the debate. And I hope it was clear what I tried to present you on the European framework. Thank you.
Dankeschön, Matthias. Thank you. Gracias. Y ahora vamos a... Espera que voy a quitar la traducción, que si no me lío. Ahora vamos a abrir un pequeño turno de preguntas a Matthias, porque la situación, como habéis podido escuchar, está muy caliente. En estos días hay muchos debates. Para el 15 de octubre habrá resultados de todo este trabajo que se está proponiendo y en el que EAPN ha estado muy implicada. La presidencia alemana está empujando fuerte y entonces es un momento en el que todos tenemos que prestar, a los que nos interesan estos temas, tenemos que estar prestando atención a lo que pasa en Europa, ¿no? Hay muchos puntos, evidentemente no es el único, también está el tema de los fondos. Sabemos que a partir del 15 de octubre también la Comisión va a recibir las propuestas de planes de recuperación de los Estados miembros, en los cuales también se esperan medidas muy importantes en materia de empleo, tal como está propuesto por las directrices que la propia Comisión hizo para el uso de estos fondos, relacionados con el empleo verde y la digitalización. O sea que son muchos temas que están pasando ahora mismo en Europa y que requieren que estemos atentos y atentas. Entonces, Sally pide la palabra y le doy la palabra.
Hola, buenos días. Buenos días a todos y a todas. Y Matthias, me alegra conocerte. Soy vicepresidenta de EAPN España, pero no hemos tenido ocasión todavía de saludarnos. A mí hay una cuestión que me preocupa, que tú ya lo has apuntado, hablando del Pilar Europeo de Derechos Sociales, cuando has dicho que no es vinculante. Ese es un problema que tenemos con muchos instrumentos tan valiosos que tiene la Unión Europea. Yo recuerdo cuando el anterior presidente de la Comisión, Juncker, decía que el Pilar no iba a ser un poema, es decir, que había que llevarlo a la práctica. Pero claro, el hecho de que no sea vinculante nos trae problemas. Nos pasa igual incluso con los fondos europeos, que hay un reglamento de obligado cumplimiento, pero luego cada Estado lo lee a su manera. Pero hay otra cuestión que me preocupa muchísimo y son las directivas. Que las directivas, pues como sí que son de obligado cumplimiento, pero aquí en España pues tenemos unos ejemplos que no me gustaría que ocurriera, si ojalá sale la de rentas mínimas, porque la directiva 2043, por ejemplo, de no discriminación e igualdad de trato, pues en España sí, se acató, pero la transposición se hizo tarde y mal, todavía está mal. Ayer en el Congreso de los Diputados todavía una diputada ha puesto de manifiesto que realmente el espíritu que tenía esa directiva en España no se lleva a cabo. Entonces, como EAPN a largo plazo, porque lo nuestro siempre es de paciencia, yo creo que tendríamos que hacer también lobby, presión, para que todos estos instrumentos tan valiosos no se quedaran en un poema. Y bueno, es una preocupación que tengo siempre. Gracias.
Matthias, before you talk, just 1 minute.
Yeah,
por favor,
thanks,
todos...
Sally. I mean, but you are right.
No,
you're obviously fully right in this, but it's very, very clear. It's also written in the pillar of social rights, which was adopted, as you know, in 2017. It's explicitly written there that this is a declaration of principles in a way of goodwill that sets the framework, as we have said. But it's clearly written there is in one of the recitals that in order for these principles to have any legal value, either there need to be measures at member state level or by the European Union, normally then directives, or obviously a coordination by both. There can be, as you also said, programs by funding, and Graciela also just mentioned it. We have the European Social Fund. That might be an instrument, especially to help those countries that have very low minimum income levels now to improve their adequacy. And this new Resilience and Recovery Fund could also be, in theory, used to do this. So these funds are binding, and indeed, there you need to also report how you use the money. But that's why we have talked about the points that Graciela and myself presented about a directive or framework directive on minimum wages, and our demand of EAPN of a framework directive on minimum income, because the pillar is a nice declaration, and the action plan that will now be elaborated can help also to realize this. But as I also said, there is in the pipeline, it's not yet there, there is a directive on gender pay gap and on pay equality, put it like this, but obviously it's more around the differences that women have lower wages in general, and the systematic structural issue around all this, and pay transparency. So as long as these legally binding instruments are not there, and legally binding means that's also the advantage of a framework directive. It means that the European Commission can monitor and can see if member states implement the rules, the principles, the provisions, and if they don't implement on, as you said, on discrimination, on equality, on pay equality, on minimum wage if it comes, on minimum income if it comes, if they don't implement this or are not working alongside the sense or the purpose of this directive, then they can make an infringement procedure. They can be brought to court. These rules can be enforced. If we have the European semester, we all know if we have the pillar, it's not binding. There are some proposals, there are recommendations, member states need to report, they need to morally justify themselves, morally, but not more. If you have a directive, it can be monitored. It can also be monitored by including social partners, employer organizations, trade unions, or civil society organizations. EAPN, you can say, please, and that's what you are doing. EAPN Spain, our other EAPN organizations are watchdogs. As you know, you analyze the policy, you make proposals for your national level, you bring them to our attention. So if this is the case, then also EAPN Spain has a stronger role. EAPN has a stronger role because we can contribute to this monitoring. That's the whole debate, and that's a big challenge to make the rights, the social rights, the human rights that normally we have in our national constitutions, at least on paper, we have in most countries. You also in Spain, we in Germany, we have it on paper, I think. But to make this more a reality and to have an effective fight against exclusion, discrimination, and poverty. So that's a more effective fight, at least, and more need to justify if you are not acting. I think that's also an important point why we are so strongly supporting a directive. And you have seen, I mentioned that there was, or there still is, a council recommendation on adequate resources and social assistance from the year 1992. So in 2 years, this will be 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, since then, we have a council recommendation. And it's a recommendation. Again, it puts moral pressure, it helps to exchange between member states, and it has had some effect. For sure, it has had some effect. Also, the Commission recommendation on active inclusion of 10 years ago had some effect, because you could talk more on it, you could more remind member states, you could exchange good practices. It has some effect, but it didn't have the sufficient effect of poverty reduction, of reduction of in-work poverty. In-work poverty even increased very strongly in the last 10 years. So That's why we are in favor of these binding frameworks and this binding legislation at EU level.
Muchas gracias, Matías. Quiero recordaros, por favor, que tenemos una interpretación y tenemos que hablar un poco despacio para que se pueda hacer de manera correcta, ¿vale? Porque si no es muy difícil, tenemos mucha terminología técnica, etc. Yo quiero hacer un pequeño comentario de esto, y es que adicional a lo de Matías, y luego le doy la palabra a Nuria, cuando tenemos una directiva tenemos la capacidad de exigir la aplicación de la ley europea en nuestros países, y si nos vemos afectados en nuestros derechos fundamentales podemos recurrir al Tribunal de Estrasburgo, que es el tribunal que tiene la competencia cuando ya el Estado miembro no está respetando la ley europea. Quiero decir que ahí se abren unos cauces legales importantes al tener una directiva, pero bueno. Nuria, adelante.
Gracias, Graciela. Bueno, yo en primer lugar, a ver si soy capaz de hablar despacio, porque yo hablo de por sí muy rápido, entonces para no complicar a Viviana, en primer lugar agradecer a Matías esta exposición tan interesante que ha hecho, me parece, vamos, un tema totalmente necesario que suscita muchas dudas y que suscita pues muchas controversias, como en España vivimos hace poco, ¿no? En España hemos tenido, no sé, me imagino que Matías es conocedor, pero desde el 2007 a ahora, al 2020, el salario mínimo se ha incrementado en un 66%. Y ha sido un tema muy controvertido porque, lógicamente, los agentes sociales, con intereses distintos y a veces no siempre coincidentes, pues, bueno, pues se ha trasladado a la negociación colectiva y ha sido, ya digo, un tema que ha ocasionado muchas discrepancias. Entonces, yo querría plantear solamente 3 temas que no sé si están sobre la mesa o no, Matías. En primer lugar, querría plantear si en esa directiva futura se tiende al establecimiento de un salario mínimo global europeo. O sea, en algún momento veremos esto. Bueno, todavía la convergencia que todos esperamos algún día conseguir, social y económica y política, yo creo que, bueno, pues que se está trabajando mucho en ello, pero a efectos de establecer un salario mínimo europeo, no sé si es un tema que se encuentra sobre la mesa. En segundo lugar, como apuntabas, y desde luego creo que es algo en los que todos debiéramos trabajar, todos los que hacemos políticas públicas, es el establecimiento de medidas o de acciones de discriminación positiva para reducir la brecha, no solo a nivel de salarios, sino a nivel de pensiones, como apuntabas. Ese problema que tenéis en Alemania, desde luego en España lo tenemos también. Hay una brecha de género tremenda en las pensiones, muy particularmente en las pensiones de jubilación. Sí que en los últimos años se han establecido algunos mecanismos, como por ejemplo los hijos incrementan la pensión de jubilación para las mujeres, pero la brecha sigue siendo tremenda. Entonces no sé si se contempla también en esa futura directiva el establecimiento de algún tipo de acción de discriminación positiva. Y luego lo último, para no extenderme, también quisiera saber si, como planteabas, efectivamente en cada país de la Unión los mecanismos para los establecimientos de salarios mínimos son distintos, ¿no? En el caso de España es una especie de sistema mixto donde hay un salario mínimo interprofesional legal, pero luego queda condicionado también a la negociación de las partes, los posibles incrementos, ¿no? O los posibles ajustes. Entonces, quisiera saber también si en esa directiva en la que se está trabajando se contempla algún instrumento preferente, si el negociado, el legal o algún sistema mixto, o se deja a la autonomía de los países. Nada más. Gracias.
Matías, go ahead, please. We have until 4 minutes.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. And I also apologize because we are always speaking too quickly. That is really a difficulty. Sorry, also Viviana, for me speaking much too quick. No, I start, Nuria, with your last question because it's the easiest in a way to answer to. And neither EAPN nor the trade unions nor anybody would ask any country to change the current existing system. That's not a request at all. And that has been obviously a big issue of discussion because interestingly, you also know this, in the countries, as I said, where they have their social partners define all wages, but also in a way, directly, indirectly, the minimum wages. These are the countries, except for Cyprus, where the minimum wages are rather high. So, and where the collective bargaining and the collective agreement coverage is rather high. These are the Nordic countries where you have 80 to 90% of workers covered by collective bargaining. And in Austria, which is the only country in Central Europe that has this social partner-based minimum wage, 98% of the workers are covered. So these are even the successful models. And we don't ask for any change. Why should this happen? It's also the autonomy of the social partner to fix it. They know best what is possible and also what is economically possible. But in the other 22 countries where you have statutory minimum wages, it's obviously needed that you need to arrive at a level that will prevent from falling into poverty, because otherwise it's a zero-sum game. At the other hand, then you have to have higher social assistance, higher minimum income, higher benefits that are paid for those that have too low wages, especially in the cases where the employers really have exploitative conditions and pay not enough money, and where the state budget has to come in to fill up the income gap and all this. So, but nobody asks any change, and that will be also very clearly written in this directive if it comes from the Commission. There is no change. The systems can change as they are, and you said it for Spain, I know it for Germany, it's exactly the same. There is a statutory minimum wage, but still the social partners have an important role to also play in negotiating the minimum wage. The other point is, indeed, we would expect from a European framework directive, a clear move, Nuria, towards a social and economic upwards convergence, because indeed, we talk here only on the minimum level benefits, and that these are again social rights, human rights. It's not about higher wages or whatever, but we know that in a European Union where we have an internal market, where there is mobility, and you have also suffered from this in a way in the last crisis in Spain, when many qualified workers left Spain, many nurses went to Germany, for example, in the Nordic countries. So you have seen that it's very easy for us European citizens to move to another country, and we still have enormous differences in income, in working conditions, in living conditions. So we need, at least, we cannot allow that Europe goes more and more divisive, and there are even bigger gaps between Bulgaria and Luxembourg, to say the two examples, the extreme examples. So a minimum wage, minimum income will help, because it lifts up the lower level to a certain human rights-based minimum level. It will help also some social convergence, and it will decrease the pressure on economically related mobility across the union. And the last point, yeah, indeed, we would also obviously support those mechanisms or the legislation, as you said, that are supporting equality issues, gender, to address the gender pay gap in these issues, or other equality issues if it's about employment, so to fight non-discrimination. That's a key part of EAPN work. But again, these issues that relate to the employment conditions normally need also to be negotiated by the social partners. And then you need a strong legislative framework on the national level and the European level to help enforcing the rules that are there. So that would be my reactions. But thanks for the question.
Gracias, Matías. Nos vamos acercando al fin de este bloque del programa de trabajo que tenemos hoy. Quiero dar las gracias a Matías Mauger por su participación en esta jornada. Y también quiero agradecer a todas las personas que habéis participado con vuestra presencia, con vuestras preguntas. Os deseo muy buen trabajo y que continúe con el siguiente bloque. Le paso la palabra a Adolfo. Gracias.